This is the first time I've used Zoom for this purpose, and I should alert the viewers to the fact that if you read my guest's book, you'll see one of the most remarkably eloquent screeds against Zoom. So it's especially, you know, especially lovely, and we're especially grateful to have her with us. Okay, so I'm curious, to start us off, I wondered if you could sketch for us the conventional wisdom about autism, and then talk a little bit about how your thesis deviates from that conventional wisdom.
Well, I think to summarize, conventional wisdom is difficult because it is a very fraught topic. An awful lot seems to hang on it, and it is shifting, if not daily, then you know, quickly and all around us. And it seems to me, for example, that there is now at least an atmosphere around autism, which is reframing autism as as an identity, and as such, as something that must be allowed, like all identities, to come out. This, from my perspective, is disastrous because under the aegis of inclusion, i.e., allowing autis to come out, there will be produced a consensus that will back away from attempting to form young children with autism such that their behaviors are compatible with the world and other people. Very often they're not compatible, and it doesn't matter how inclusive people wish to be. If a man of 33 and over 6 foot stands in the metro next to you and suddenly nuzzles your neck, as men with autism who are 33 can do, that is not accommodatable, nor should it be. So in fact, this drive to somehow retreat from attempting to form young people with autism will lead to an even greater exclusion, of course, of them from any kind of normal social setting. So, insofar as I hold that view, I believe I already depart quite profoundly from the emergent consensus view around autism.
No, it's terrific. The thesis is that it's actually the society that's autistic, and what you see when you're engaged with an autistic child is actually sort of a like a Bartleby the Scrivener type character who says, I prefer not to. They're sort of involuntary dissidents in a sense, in that they highlight some of the less attractive or productive tendencies of the society at large. Am I correct
Mm.
in understanding this as your thesis?
Yes, thank you. So I began the book that is called Autistic Society Disorder. I began that, what seems like a lifetime ago now because it was before 2020. And in that book, reframe the problem of autism, and for me, it is a huge problem for people,
Mhm.
for people who have it and for people who live with it. So I reframe the problem of autism as a problem, at least also of society. In other words, the whatever propensities autistic children, and let's keep it at children for now, whatever propensities they have, whatever difficulties they have, are immeasurably exacerbated by a society that is itself autistic, in the sense that it is characterized by the classic symptoms of autism: blockage to meaningful interaction and rigidity in patterns of thought, behavior, systems, etc. So that the insertion or subjection of our children to the social institutions that channel those autistic propensities, that absolutely is absolutely detrimental to the well-being of those children. if I can just say make one modification of that point now. I mean, since then, Jeffrey, even since I began this book, the rate of diagnosis of children as autistic continues to increase. Only 2 days ago, I was speaking with someone who works with a hospital trust here in the northeast of England, works in the area of diagnosis of autism in children. And she said to me that in London now, the rate of diagnosis is 30 in 100 children. That's how she put it to me. That's 3 in 10.
Wow.
I mean, wow. And what people do not say is that profoundly, at least, autistic children do not grow up to have children. They do not grow up to have jobs. Their life expectancy, it's difficult to find data on this, but what I have found is 20 years less than their non-autistic peers. The tragedy of it is huge, immense, and it is an exclusion from human sympathy and worldly functioning that is far more profound than many more recognized disabilities, which, if they were abroad in our children, we would be clamoring for a solution. So this is very confusing, but since writing this book, I'm beginning to generate a kind of rough taxonomy of autism, because I think we require this now. One of the issues that militates against even knowing what it is that it seems to me that there are different kinds of phenomena being conflated. So I now use this taxonomy. First, clinical autism. And that is what I use to describe the autism, and this is the autism that my son has. That it emerges between the age of 2 and 3, as if from nowhere. It is dramatic, it will never retreat, and children who emerge at that age as clinically autistic are almost certainly not going to live a functional life, however so-called high functioning they may be. In other words, however high their intellectual aptitude is in certain areas of activity. But then I have also come up with what 2 forms of autism, which I believe are on the rise. One is really entrenched now, and that is the second type, which is social autism. And this, I guess, brings into this taxonomy many of the observations that I made in the book that I wrote, which is about society. And it is about the way that the social infrastructure to which we submit all children now produce in all children more or less intense autism-like symptoms.
In America, we have this very strange sort of schizophrenia when it comes to education, where on the one hand, it's the one thing that all educational theorists, do you have TED Talks? Do you watch these kind of often preposterous? If you listen to TED Talks on education, there seems to be absolute uniformity that we need. Well, that we need a lack of uniformity in education. Everyone agrees that we need the sort of approach to education that enables kids to be themselves, so on and so forth. But then when it comes time to actually come up with educational policy, we do exactly the opposite of that. And it's very, very strange. If you go to a conference of educators, the keynote speaker is very likely going to be someone who's extremely charming and dynamic and has all of these very, liberal in the best sense, attitudes towards educating children. And, everyone nods, everyone's tremendously inspired, and then they go back to work and they're in a system. People don't seem to register the incongruity between these. In the UK, is there a similar kind of confusion?
There is a lot of talk done about the sort of thing that you described there: personalized approach, children are different, the one size fits all does not produce the best educational outcomes, etc., etc. I think the effort to answer to those commitments institutionally has led to a degradation of classroom environment and of learning in the institutions, right, which can only operate on a more disciplinary, uniform, etc., in that way. So in a sense, I think the incongruity arises from a fundamental impossibility, which is institutions, the schools. I mean, I've taught in schools, and then in my adult life, I've taught in universities for many years. And such institutions do not communicate much learning that is of any worth. That is my view. So the incongruity arises from that fundamental impossibility. You cannot institutionalize learning. Because if we are to be honest, if I think about, I won't say all the things I know, because that seems to compliment myself and certainly doesn't describe a reality, but whatever it is I know, almost all of it I learned myself.
Sure.
Out in the world, through motivated self-education, through pursuing my interests, through involvement in various practical life projects, etc., etc. I recall spending hours and hours, as I say in the book at some point, with my head bowed over problems in mathematical differentiation and the like. And I remember doing quite well in examinations. Can I tell you the first thing? Could I even then tell you the first thing about what that meant? So this is, of course, the fundamental problem with the education system. And if you put an autistic child into that system, they show that at every turn. They show, so what we have, in my view, is you have a cohort of children shrinking who can pass muster as and behave and output as if they're being educated. And you have a cohort of children growing who cannot do that. And of course, in the middle of it all, you have institutions that are, stretched now to the level of nonsense. And you have professionals who end up spouting self-contradictions. What else could happen?
Yeah, I found particularly moving your story with your son about the chapstick.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a really wonderful way of illustrating the distinction, as you see it, between care and safety, and that is that. I wondered if you could summarize for our listeners, viewers, what sketch that story out and talk a little bit about what its implications are.
It's a very boring story, and in a way intentionally so, because it foregrounds really the when you have autism, you don't have a world. This is how I try to summarize it. You don't have a world, you have bits. And this is why people with autism are prone to distress a lot of the time, because when the world impacts, they're not ready. They have no ability to predict that or to understand it for the most part. However, if you care for someone with autism and attempt to bring them with you, alongside you at least, as you proceed around the world, then you yourself become attuned to bits, to the most mundane things, because that's where they're at. And you, of course, you know intimately, if you're their mother, as I am, what their bits are, and so on. So the banality of it is extraordinary. And I mean that in the best way, because care of people, and this is where the real tragedy in our society has been the bastardization of care, really, as if care can be sorted at the level of the protocol. And really, where care occurs is below the radar of all of that. And in this story that I told was intended to illustrate that. And it has to do with the fact, when Joseph was about 5 and 6, and even still, but we have got into a routine to solve it. He began to, irritate his lips all the time. And, his response, he could not talk at that time. There was no way he could alert me to the fact that they were uncomfortable. He could also not make judgments about what would best, improve their condition. So he would rub them. And you know, he had spent a few periods of his young life at that time with very, very sore face, really. And, you know, very distressing as a parent to see that and to feel that one was neglectful in some way. So the application of what you charmingly, I like Americanisms, that seemed like an Americanism to me, chapstick. Over here,
Oh,
we
sorry.
call it lip balm, or
Ah.
no, I understood that. That's fine. But I mean, we call it lip balm, or there's that generic brand Vaseline, which has taken over the territory, I guess, although I don't use that one. But anyhow, so, you know, I would apply that to his lips very often. And he had a one-to-one support person at school who was a very nice person at that time. And, you know, without thinking anything of it, that morning when I brought Joseph to school, I said, please put this on, apply this at least once every hour. We need to make sure that this situation doesn't deteriorate. But anyhow, another teacher, having seen the tub being applied, you know, wondered whether Joseph's file contained this product named in it as something that could be applied. Had I signed a consent for such a thing? And of course, the answer to all that was no. And then by the time they had phoned me and I had driven to the school and I'd been talked to the safety through the health and safety protocol, etc., you know, Joseph's lips really had deteriorated significantly. And we had another 5 days of misery. And, you know, the level of distress and misery that can occur in a child, an autistic child of 5 and 6, is sublime. So this is not a small thing, you know. But again, it was just a very simple example of how the utterly mundane, repetitive, up close and personal, skin to skin activity of applying balm on the lips of a child was sidelined by the institution's desire to be to keep everybody safe. And obviously this drive for safety has become just overwhelming in the last number of years, and has really revealed itself to anyone who is looking on with any sense as anathema to care.
Mhm.
The very thing that really eradicates the possibility of care, which is very concerning.
Well, let me ask you, you write very engagingly about abstraction. That
Mm.
abstraction is one of our enemies. That essentially, in the situation with the lip balm, I'll call it, the teacher saw not a human being, but sort of an instance of an abstract category. That here's a child who sort of represents, you know, the Platonic idea of child. And this is not an individual. This isn't a set of needs confronting you as a human being, and they're a human being. But right now, we're using an awful lot of abstraction, and I'm curious what the best way to think about abstraction is, because clearly that's an important part of pedagogy. You know, you have to steer students in the direction of being able to think about, you know, big questions. So what is the correct way to think about abstraction? Is it something that we should introduce into our kids' education in a different way or at a different time? Is there a kind of responsible abstraction, or is all abstraction, to use a, you know, really hideously overused word, problematic?
I've never even heard that word. So this is a very, I mean, it's a great question. And as someone, I mean, my background is in philosophy, and that is what I taught at university for years before I mean, I now don't work in it professionally because my son doesn't go to school anymore. So we muddle along together. But so, I mean, as someone whose background is in philosophy, of course, I ought to agree with you, Jeffrey, that we do need to direct our children's attention to big questions, etc.
Mhm.
But I wonder whether we really do. Or perhaps I ought to say that I wonder whether the explicit doing of that really is a directing of our children towards big questions. Let me
Right.
give you an example. I mean, I used to teach existentialism when I taught at university. That was one of the kind of first year courses that I might teach. And I loved teaching that, primarily because to do any kind of job of teaching existential philosophy, you have to, it is your duty to attempt to make students realize things. So it's not about presenting abstract ideas. And it is certainly not, in fact, all philosophy is like this, but existentialism really foregrounds it. It is not about, facilitating them in their learning how to manipulate these ideas in essays or in talk, etc. They must make a realization. They must feel it. And really, you could only know that they would feel it as if they began, at least initially, to look very depressed. Mm-hmm. And they never did, ever, and because it was very difficult to make them feel, for example, that we all die. Mm-hmm. They all knew that as an abstraction. Of course they did, but they were very comfortable with it. No, you cannot begin a course on existentialism until you are capable of discomfort with that fact. You would be surprised how immune it seems. And for me, the immunity came from the ease with abstraction. So big ideas are not abstract ideas. This is the thing. And very oddly, Joseph, my son, when I say he cannot deal in abstractions, for example, he cannot use pronouns. And you see, they're an abstraction. Well, you know that it's me, right? But I could be you if you say it, mm-hmm. or him, you see? Whereas we must use, personal pronouns. I say, Mama will do this. Joseph will do that. We don't use pronouns. He can't grasp those. He does not understand what a mother is. So he knows I am Mama, but he has no sense that I am the same in relation to him as the child up the street's mother is in relation to them. And once because people don't usually say Mama here, it's an old, I suppose, Irish way of calling your mother. Mm. But once on the ferry to Ireland, we heard some child say Mama, and Joseph looked, there's another one, Wow. So that is the way that he is excluded from even the most fundamental abstractions. However, Joseph knows, he feels what it is to die. Mm-hmm. And this is extraordinary, because about 2 years ago, he said, Joseph is 9, and then 10, and then 11, and then 12, and he kept counting. Uh-huh. And then 98, and then 99, and I thought, oh my God. And then 100, and I said, and then finished. I said, mm-hmm. and then finished. Well, he was devastated. Wow. He can't express that, mm-hmm. except he was crying and, very upset, because obviously it was beginning to dawn on him. Mm-hmm. And so then I said, not because, of course, what child should or could cope with that existential realization at 9 and without many, So I said to him, then back to 0. Mm-hmm. And he was happy with that. But a few months later, he said to me, and Mama, 90, 91, 92, 99, 100. And then I said, and back to 0. Devastated. Because, of course, he was thinking, well, if I'm 0, who's taking care of him?
Sure.
So quickly I said, and he didn't say that, but I could see that's the problem. So I said, and back to 30. So now, we are now developing, an ad hoc, but very complex metaphysics. Uh-huh. And I have to make sure I keep the thing in my head so that I don't say in an absent-minded way the wrong thing. Because basically at the moment, if you're over 30, you get to 100, go back to 30. Mm-hmm. And if you're under 30, you get to 100 and go back to 0. Obviously this is going to be a work in progress as we proceed, and people, for example, around him die, etc. I have no idea how we're going to cope with that, but that's realization.
Well, let me ask you, do you think that autistic, to the extent that existentialism is sort of organized around the idea that existence is kind of a problem, that, the sheer fact of existence kind of hurts slightly. Do you think that autistic kids, or the people who we label autistic, are natural-born existentialists?
I hesitate to make any claim of that kind because, for example, I did an interview recently, and in which I used that example of Joseph doesn't know what a mother is. And one of the comments, is, oh, but how one of the comments written underneath was, how do you know, how do you know he doesn't know that? How do you, because there is this drive to, there must be some genius inside, this is one of the ways in which autism is normalized and made acceptable in our society, because it is, just taken for granted that there is some corner of brilliance. Really, I don't subscribe to that. There, among autistic people, there are people who are, more or less apt, etc., etc. But it is not for me defining. But whether or not they're capable of existential attunement, more than the ordinary, I would say at least potentially yes, only because all of the ways in which we sublimate that anxiety are not available to them, or almost none of the ways.
Sure.
They're very raw. If they're allowed, if they're helped to be in the world in any way, and very often they're not, so they are in a sense, screened off either literally or figuratively. But if they are in the world, they are raw because they are without the armor that we acquire very naturally as we go through childhood.
I'm curious, what do you think philosophers have to contribute, particularly to this discussion of autism? I know that, at least in the United States, I really shudder to think at the gravity of problems that, like, education people have undertaken to make their property. There's so much nonsense that comes out of education departments in America. It's a real crisis, a crisis that people are beginning to get a pretty comprehensive sense of. And I'm curious, your book came as a real breath of fresh air. It was tremendously engaging because it gave me access to a perspective that, I simply never hear, a philosopher who is learned in the field, but also enormously attuned to the sort of the granular facts of life and the minutia of the experience of an individual child with autism. Do you think that, people with a philosophical background have a particular contribution to make to this conversation? And what other non-education people, to put it loosely, do you would you like to be hearing more from on this issue? Would you like to hear musicians, carpenters? What perspectives do you think we really ought to be hearing?
Well, from my perspective, autism is an astoundingly intriguing condition philosophically, because it challenges what is really a defining tenet of at least modern European philosophy, which is that human beings are worlded. And really, a lot of, if not most, modern European philosophy is motivated by an attempt to try to establish the grounds of reason, feeling, judgment in the context of the inevitable worldedness of human experience. Now, autism, as I said, could really be summarized as a condition of being more or less unworlded. So philosophically, it's a hugely interesting condition, and one is really in the position of putting the cart before the horse a bit. The question is not the philosophical question of how to in some way neutralize our worldedness or distance ourselves from it, or etc., etc., in order to gain some perspective from which we might develop an ethics, or etc. But rather the opposite question of how do you bring someone into a world. My philosophical background is in an area of philosophy called hermeneutics. But the kind of leading star of that branch of philosophy is a German thinker called Hans-Georg Gadamer. And, so I wrote my PhD largely on Gadamer's work. And Gadamer's big question is how do we cope with, how do we make the most of the inevitable situatedness of human experience? So I find it really interesting that I'm left now with a practical opposite problem, which
Uh-huh.
is how do we actually bring someone into a situation,
Sure.
which is actually a more difficult job, I think. So yeah, so at least that is, I think, a philosophically intriguing scenario. Yeah, I mean, it's a look. I guess insofar as philosophy has become encased in third level in academic institutions, like all disciplines that are worthwhile, it has atrophied there, and sort of found itself in various silos in which people enjoy swilling around in their mouths the impossible kind of taxonomies of their particular area of interest. And
Mhm.
I mean, that's very a negative account, but it really is. I was outraged, I suppose. I have been outraged, especially in the last number of years at I mean, do you know how many conferences I went to in which Levinas scholars held forth on the importance of the face? All of them masked up during COVID
Sure.
without a thought. So for me, the academy has really affected a total disconnect between philosophical learning and any kind of philosophical practice.
Yeah.
So I feel frustrated very much at that, and it's my view really that anyone who is philosophically trained now, very very few are concerning themselves with worldly issues, and certainly not with childhood conditions of kind of childhood well-being or not. I would say it's very limited. But as to who else might do it, you're right, educationalists. I mean, the problem with these disciplines, Jeffrey, is that they suffer from what I call Autistic Society Disorder. It's a people tend to become initiated into a register, and they operate within that register, and they feel quite defensive of it, and so you have very myopic views on situations. I mean, so I'm about to give a talk to a group of health professionals here in the Northeast on the topic of autism. But the person who has invited me to do so seems very nervous. And I think she's afraid that I will upset the people there who are all professionals,
Mhm.
but who are not accustomed, for example, to asking the question, what is autism? They're not
Mhm.
accustomed to that question. They're not accustomed to the question, oh, worse of all, does autism have a cause? You
Mhm.
can't ask that, which is an extraordinary silencing and
Mhm.
concealment. So I've answered your question very negatively. I don't know what carpenters might have to say, but again, and they suffer also from the kind of the fact that people have found themselves in walks of life where if you're a thinking person, well, you're off into the academy. If you're a practical person, you're off making cabinets, but almost
Sure.
never the twain shall meet.
Right.
And the dismantling of public life, of social life, the channeling of people into, online echo chambers, etc., all militate against the what should be a kind of whole society discussion.
When I was reading your book, such as the political climate that we're all living in, that I found myself, even in spite of myself, trying to sort out whether this book is a conservative book or a liberal book, which is an absolutely preposterous binary, but it seems to
Yeah.
be the world we're living in. And, it seems that on the one hand, it's quote unquote left wing to the extent that it's an attack on sort of modern industrial capitalism and the systematization of things that ought not to be systematized. But it's also an attack on ideological uniformity, which seems to
Yeah.
be the domain of, I mean, nowadays, the domain of sort of anti-woke. Yeah, I don't even know what to call them. I mean, they're not traditional conservatives, but, people who are in favor of a kind of diversity that's no longer really in fashion. at least on the left.
Mm.
What are the political implications of your thesis and of the questions that you've been asking?
Well, I suppose I would, identify myself as a conservative with a small c.
Hmm.
Certainly, if you live in the UK, very, very small c. So, yeah, I mean, because I am interested in what a certain group of Italian philosophers whose work I like to read, and not just them, you know, what they wish to draw people's attention to as forms of life.
Hmm.
And so these are, ways of living that, and these were the way in which human beings' lives were organized prior to the modern era, where kind of, and they were productive of cultures, real proper cultures, as opposed to manufactured corporate generic culture, which is what
Hmm.
we're all consuming increasingly now. So in the book that I wrote about autism is intended as an argument for at least, I mean, a return to some forms of living, where learning is understood to arise as part of involvement in shared ways of life, where care is distributed, in the commons, among families, kinship groups, neighbors, etc., and where health is something that is attended to in more accessible and local ways, as opposed to through very empty categories and products whose names we cannot even pronounce, but which
Sure.
we pop daily. So it's really an argument for at least that we would begin to feel regret for the loss of these forms of life. And I mean, I like to read the work of these Italian philosophers. Paolo Virno is the writer whose work I appreciate most in that set, or Ivan Illich, whose long life's work is full of the most inspiring accounts of, what has been lost to, Western post-industrial societies. So, and I mean, I guess in the book, what I want to do is to position the institutionalization of health, education, care, of society, and of self.
So, as I was editing this video, I discovered that I had screwed something up and managed to lose a bit of video and audio in which I asked a question. The question was about a passage in Dr. Murphy's book where she discusses the ways in which the Autistic Society forces people to make explicit what is supposed to be implicit. Explicitness being inherently performative and therefore less authentic than anything implicit, which tends to be rather more humane. She engages with this question by identifying some of the questions inside of the question that I had asked, eventually looping back around to an extremely illuminating and direct response.
We're going somewhere, we're driving somewhere, but the car is not moving. Now, it's not moving because there's a traffic jam, but Joseph can't understand that. He can only experience a car that's not moving and will sometimes become extremely distressed. So the context is something that he cannot appreciate, and certainly not shifting in and out of different contexts is impossible for him. But neither is he able to enter into even the most basic of purposes, right? So washing your hands. It's not that he can't remember how to wash his hands, it's that he cannot buy into that one should wash hands. And then take that and that one should try to do well in a school or at a sport. It's just that he cannot even get that. He cannot see it. So the push of context and the pull of purposes are not there.
Mhm.
So it is for that reason very, very difficult to get them on board and to keep them on board.
Sure.
Now, arguably, that those two problems, those two challenges, are to some extent now rolled out to all of us who live in this global scenario. Because on the one hand, the context is a global one. Arguably, that context cannot be very meaningful for us. It's too, it does not generate the kind of horizon of meaning that human beings are capable of.
Mm-hmm.
So we are left with a low meaning context.
Mm-hmm.
And then the purposes that we are increasingly being asked to orientate ourselves towards, net zero, climate, one health, safety, these are all so empty, and they appear to be able to accommodate contradictory things.
Mm-hmm.
So to pursue safety, well, you might actually put yourself in danger of mental illness, or, if you stay, I mean, they security, these words now we're pummeled by them, and they can mean all kinds of things, including contradictory things. And therefore, again, the purposes of our lives become things that we can't, that do not capture us. So we are, in that sense, now arguably beginning to experience what it's like to be autistic, because the pull of context and purpose has, at the very least, diminished, weakened.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, and then this is why we cleave to solutions, because if the drop down list of possible answers, we'll pick from that, because we're really, to some disengaged. We're disengaged, and if you're disengaged, it's hard to come up with an answer. It's hard to just muster up the wherewithal.
Mm-hmm.
So we become ready applicants to all kinds of centralized solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So that I think is one problem about the global scenario. Now, of course, it becomes, it's very difficult to articulate that nowadays, because it's often regarded as a kind of rose-tinted nostalgia for a time when we were not, the world was not one village, and we were not zooming across 2,000 miles, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But I really don't mind being thought of like that, because I do regard human lives as flourishing most within narrower horizons.
Are you familiar with, there's a wonderful quote from Pete Seeger, who's an American banjo player and social activist. And he once made this comment about Barry Goldwater, who was the sort of pre-Ronald Reagan conservative. And Pete Seeger said, I'm much more, and Pete Seeger was a card-carrying communist for a time. And he said, I'm much more conservative than Goldwater. He said, Goldwater wants to go back to the time before the income tax. He said, I want to go back to the time when we lived in little villages and cared about each other.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Well, yes. And I mean, we are, I suppose, almost expected to be apologetic for that. Mm-hmm. And, I'm not apologetic about that, because that the philosopher on whom I wrote my PhD dissertation, Gadamer, his life's work was aimed at what he called the rehabilitation of prejudice, mm-hmm. where prejudice is prejudgment. And for Gadamer, nothing can happen without prejudgment, because that is the base camp, that is the springboard from which enterprises, set forth. From, we understand people, texts, events on the basis of a set of very strong presuppositions. And that is what allows us to understand. Now, he made that his life's work because he saw that the opposite was being promoted, that prejudice was being reframed as an obstacle to understanding, and that the aim is to empty people of their prejudices, their ways, their idiosyncrasies, etc., and then they are available for what? For what, you see? And then what has replaced them are too empty, they're too broad, and of course they are of the provenance of the new kind of concepts and identities, etc., strategies, all these modes that we now engage in substitute for the prejudices that we've left behind.
Mm-hmm.
Well, their provenance is, corporate, it's globalist, and we become puppets of, well, others' agenda. So
Sure.
it's not truth, it's not freedom, it's nothing like that. That's I guess of relevance here. But what you were saying about the implicit and the explicit is interesting. And in the book, I make this point, for example, about health,
Mm-hmm.
that arguably, by definition, health is implicit.
Mm-hmm.
Because being healthy means not concerning oneself with one's health. It means riding the bike, going for a run, going out with friends, working at your job. It means doing all the things that you do when you're not thinking about health.
Mm-hmm.
So that rendering explicit the question of health. And now we are being bombarded with this. We are expected to, here the NHS, the National Health Service, is rolling out an app which they wish all of us to download. There's a reason to throw your smartphone in the river if there weren't 100 others. And through that app, you will, effectively input data about yourself constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And it will then recommend various courses of action, products, etc. This is the ideal. And supposedly 35 million people have already downloaded it, although I don't believe that. Yeah, I mean, but just think of that as, how opposed that is to the conditions under which real health occur, which is a condition of forgetting. So there it is. Unfortunately, the culture in which everything must be made explicit is therefore a culture in which no one can be healthy.
That's very interesting. That's a very clarifying idea.
At last.
No, it's wonderful. I get these remarkable emails from my health insurance company. We have private insurance in the United States, and it's always trying to, bribe me with little, a little $50 gift card for Amazon or something. If
Yeah.
I'll tell it everything that's going on in my body, and it wants to know my blood sugar and my weight and my A1C and the whole business. And then it sends you these, these little pep talks, when it feels that, when the algorithm is under the impression that you could be doing better. And I have to say, even though I understand, rationally that there's no actual human being who's proud of me, when my weight goes down or my blood sugar is brought under control, it's very difficult to receive those emails and not feel a kind of warmth. It's in spite of myself. It's a very, very bizarre thing.
But the one thing that is eroded in all of that process is the practice at attuning oneself to one's own, for example, physical state. So Joseph and I, we do what's called a park run here every Saturday morning. You may not have that. Again, this is an entirely centrally engineered phenomenon, but we do it, and it's a 5K run in a local park, right? And maybe 500 people go to this particular one. It's huge. But people have now got all these watches, that tell them things about their body state as they're running. And I mean, I cannot imagine how boring it must be to be subject to this kind of conversation. But I pass people, and one of them may be telling the other that they're not in the green zone yet. They're looking at their watch, as they're running, and what their aim is to be in the green zone for 12 minutes. I mean, it's so dull. But it also makes me think that, do you even know if you are out of breath? Do you know whether you could run faster or not? Have you? And it's not just that you're just not bothering attending to that. It's the question is now, can you attend to it?
Mhm.
Do you even know what that is? And this is another, autism creep, in the sense that many autistic people, Joseph is certainly like this, appear not to know what are very basic things about their own body, whether
Mhm.
they're hungry, whether they need to go to the toilet, this kind of thing. But I look at these people, and the same thing about whether we're full or not full, whether we're tired or not tired. I mean, sleeplessness among teenagers is now absolutely endemic.
Sure.
So all of these very basic body experiences are not just being ignored by us. The question really is, are we even able to achieve them any
Mhm.
longer? So that is another kind of sinister side to this turn towards rendering explicit every function and every feeling.
Yeah, I was shocked to hear from one of my former students that I had no idea that you could get a nursing degree online.
Oh,
Which is, I don't know if advance, if that's quite the word I'm looking for, has reached British shores, but I just can't imagine, being treated by a nurse whose training didn't involve, the physical proximity of human beings. It's
you're missing an important point there, Jeffrey.
uh,
All of her work will be done online. So she must be trained online. I mean,
yeah.
you say has this progress, that we ironically use, come here. I can tell you, as far as I know, we in the UK are absolutely at the vanguard of
Mhm.
every piece of demise of health provision, because we have the NHS, and nowhere
Mhm.
else has that.
Mhm.
And this is a massive organization I mean, which you cannot sign out of.
Mhm.
I live here. I cannot untether myself from the NHS,
Mhm.
right? So, I mean, obviously, if I can walk and think, I cannot go there. But if I fall down unconscious in the street, they will have me.
Wow.
So you can't carry a card saying, leave me alone. No.
Mhm.
So the reach of this organization is absolutely vast, and the data grab, I mean, is just immense. And it is terrible. There are some, you know, um, roles in life. Nursing is one, teaching is another. Which, the care sector. I mean, that's got to be the worst of all.
Yeah.
Where the falling off is so painful to think about. So yeah, but the online nursing degree, I think, is now sadly highly appropriate.
Why should we